Welcome to Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. This is something to talk about. And we're going to be talking about gardening today with Ann Lovejoy. Thank you, Ann, as always, for coming to help us do a better job with our horticultural activities. I really appreciate that.
It's my pleasure. It's really fun to talk plant geek stuff with other people anytime.
I want to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the ancestral homeland of the Puget Sound Coast Salish Suquamish people, the people of the clear salt water. We are very grateful for the hospitality and the education that we are able to get from members of the tribe so that we can do a better job of learning from them about stewardship of the land and waters uh, on which we live. We also want to thank Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island, which sponsors the Something to Talk About programs. They offer assisted and independent living and memory care up on Rolling Bay. They have a lovely campus up there, right around the corner from Bay Hay and Feed. And they'd love to give you a tour to find out about their day stay respite programs and their dwellings. Call 206-594-1010. Visit their website at fieldstonecommunities.com or email Ashley C at fieldstonecommunities.com. And we're still in winter, but there's light now.
Boy, doesn't that help? It just
Yeah.
feels so different to me. Like, yeah. And all this little rain is so welcome. I don't know if people are aware that we are so behind. We are in still in a drought stage, and our snowpack is really, really low, like critically low. So water is going to be a huge issue this summer, no matter which way it goes. So one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about is like after the frost, how to take care of our soil to make sure that it's able to store as much moisture as possible without being too much and turning into a soggy boggy, which can also happen. Because that's going to be a super important point as we go on through this year. And our plants are going to be very, very grateful if we can offer them a good birth, a good home spot, right? So, and I'm also just so all of you know, I encourage you to interrupt with your questions. You can put your hand up with the little, what do you call that thing?
Reaction button.
The reaction button. You can
At
do
the
that.
bottom, it says raise hand,
Yeah,
just like that.
just like that. Hey, Anita. So you can do that, or you can put something in the chat and it will come up and I'll see that. Because you know me, I can just talk for a really long time. And I may not hit what you are curious about. But I did want to start with the soil because, as we all know, gardening really does start with the soil. And one thing that happens when we get into the cold weather like we did down in the teens or lower in some places is the soil starts to freeze deeper than usual. Because here in the maritime Northwest, we often don't really get deep freeze. The soil doesn't usually freeze more than maybe an inch or two. And when it gets colder like that for long enough, like a few days or a week or whatever, then it starts going deeper. And what that can do is really be kind of hard on the soil structure. So it's really important that after the freeze comes the thaw, and then the soil is beautiful. Like farmers used to talk about, one of the best ways to prepare soil is to have it freeze and thaw because it opens up all those, tight spaces. Well, then we walk on it. And when you think about your full weight going on a space the size of your insole, it's a lot of weight on a not very big space, right? And so one of the things I always try to encourage people to do is like stay out of the garden for a while, let the soil recover and start to breathe and get some life back into it and minimize walking on the gardens as much as possible. If you really have to, it's a really good idea to have like a kneeler pad or even a square of plywood that you can put down and kneel on that, which spreads the weight over a much bigger area. Obviously, in a small border with a lot of stuff coming up, that might be a little harder. But that's a good reminder to put stepping stones into bigger borders. That can be like those cement blocks or pavers or whatever, pieces of flat rock. But things that you can step on that it's already been compressed and it's not going to be it's a no-grow zone already, right? And so it doesn't matter so much and you can work from those. I like to put them in pairs because I am no longer able to stand on one leg and perform interesting events with my hands. And so rather than falling over and wrecking everything, give yourself 2 points of access right? And in a couple places in the deep, big borders, I've actually put some stakes that are about 3 feet high so I can hold on to them. There's only a couple places I need to do that, but it's really good to remember that your balance may not be all that it used to be, right?
Yeah, put a banister or a cane there waiting for you when you need it.
Well, it could turn into garden art, right? It could be something that holds a little bird feeder or something. So nobody else has to know that you're like falling over, but it reminds you that you have a task, and that task is to stay upright yourself, right? And I like to use those things around places where I know I'm going to be growing things that are going to have supports later. There you have one already, right? It could be a support, a tall support holding a bird feeder up top, and then you could put your tomato cage near it and tie it in, and it will help support that too. So it kind of works for multiple things. But always thinking about your footing, your safety, and the safety of the soil as well. So the other thing to think about at this time of year when the soil is beautiful and starting to open up is this is a great time to give it another blanket. So mature compost, you can buy bagged mixes of like compost and barn barnyard manures. Some Ace has some of those. I love that mixture. I think they call it the barnyard mix or something like that. Um, but it's a really nice, it's composted animal manures and compost itself mixed together, and it's a great top dressing. And you can put 2, 3 inches on top of soil, and it's always worth doing that every spring. And again, I usually do it twice a year because our native soils around here, first of all, many of us are gardening on soil that's actually subsoil that was been plowed and cleared long ago, or on soils that have been depleted, or on soils that used to be forest soils and then became turf soils. And that throws their whole ecology off because forest soils are fungally dominated, turf soils are bacterially dominated, and it takes a while for the soil to make that change, which is part of why sod doesn't always do very well in areas that used to be that have just been logged, like where they're putting in a new house or something like that. Um, so remembering that your soil needs time to adjust and needs some help to adjust. Compost is also buffering in pH, so it's like if your soil's kind of acidic, as most of our native soils kind of are here, that will help buffer them, which is what vegetables and even a lot of annuals and perennials really prefer. I mean, there's certainly shrubs and stuff like blueberries that like an acidic soil, and obviously the natives are all quite used to that. But many of us are growing a combination of things, and so to make that combination happy, it's a really good idea to use a good buffer like compost. Um, some people have asked me quite a bit about bark. Um, one thing I will say is that bark chunks as a top dressing are really not a good choice. For one thing, they don't add any nutritive value to the soil at all, and they tend to shed water. And when they break down, they need nitrogen, so they're taking it out of the soil, which they give back later when they break down, but that could be years. So rather than using bark chunks, you can look at bark chips, which is a whole different animal, especially the finer mix of bark chips and compost that some places are selling. That's a really good top dressing. The bark chips will help kind of keep the soil from drying out in the sun or the wind, and also help air get in and kind of reduce compaction.
So you're talking about wood chips, right? Not just the beauty bark.
Right, not just beauty bark at all, but yeah, wood chips, especially the arborist chips, which, those are in high demand a lot of times, so it's hard to get them. But if you see arborists working in your neighborhood, you can ask them if they don't have anywhere to dump the chips. You can get them to dump it in your yard, put down a tarp, and put a plate of chocolate chip cookies in the middle, and you would probably get those chips, right?
I get it. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Well, and I know that I have tried to use those as borders when I'm trying, like against my um raspberry bushes or whatever, as a walkway, put in the um wood chips as opposed as something that you can walk on.
Yeah, and that's a great way to remember. Like a lot of people in the old school were doing grass paths in the garden. Well, grass is a huge invader, so it's challenging that way. It also has the same permeability as a concrete sidewalk, pretty much. Turf, well knit turf sheds water, which in one sense is okay because it's shedding the water into your beds, but it also requires a lot of maintenance. Whereas, a wood chip path does not need to be mowed, right? There's that. And if you make it deep enough, it's pretty good at suppressing weed seeds because a lot of the weed seeds need sun and air to germinate. And if they're covered deeply enough, then you'll get way less germination than you would if it was bare soil or turf even, right? So yeah, I love to use, and you can use coarser wood chips for pathways because you're not worried about the way they look, or worried about them taking too long to break down and robbing the soil. So yeah, that's a great way to go. And they're less expensive than a lot of other top dressings too. It's,
Any other thoughts about preparing the garden? Any questions from the field here? Anybody getting ready? Of course, the last couple of days it's been kind of wet and not as pleasant, but we're going to get some good days for working outside.
Susan, it looked like you had a question maybe. You're muted though. No, never mind, sorry. But yeah, this is it's oh, Anita, do you have something?
Yeah, of course, I save coffee grounds. So I was going to mix those in with my compost and sprinkle them on the bed. Is that,
Yeah, there's
I
a
understood they were neutral.
well, they're actually they're not acidic at all, but they are closer to pH neutral, but they also have some really interesting properties. Like one of the things they do is kill slugs because there's enough caffeine left in the grounds that when the slugs trail through it, they take it up through their soft bodies, which are very absorbent, and so it dries them out. So it's coffee grounds, you can mulch things like lettuce and kale that are just targets for those little early hungry slugs, and put a circle around them that's, maybe 2 or 3 inches a band around them, because they have to crawl through to get there. They're not going to fly, right? So if you can do that, that's a great way to use those coffee grounds. But also, they're very high in nitrogen. They're 911. And so you can put them around things like roses, clematis, gross feeders that really need a lot to eat. But the other thing I think about putting them around is bulbs, because a lot of times the returning bulbs aren't quite as wonderful as they were the first year, right? We might have really good looking ones the first year we get them, and then the second year they're a little bit dweebly, and it's partly because they haven't been fed. And so feeding them while they're still in the green, but after they bloom or while they're blooming, will help build the flowers for next year.
Okay.
Right?
Mike, I just discovered today my garlic is up. I was so excited probably about that high. And I could probably, would it help to sprinkle some coffee grounds around them?
Well, garlic and onion don't really like a lot of very rich soil. They don't like a ton of nitrogen. So I wouldn't necessarily do that because you might get a big soft bulb that won't keep.
Oh, okay.
Promoting too fast, but a little bit maybe. But and worm casting, same kind of thing. They're very intense. So you just want a teeny bit, but you could mix a little bit in with your compost and that would probably be great. But the other good thing with the coffee grounds is later on when we're doing tomatoes, that is something to use that helps prevent blights, the early blight or the late blight on tomatoes. So mulching the coffee grounds later in the season for some of those. And also for things like any of the little bit semi-tender plants that you don't want to put actual fertilizer on, because a lot of the woodland plants, if you put even a 10-10-10, it can burn them to death. But a little bit of coffee grounds mixed in with maybe even some, a nice compost mix, the barnyard mix or whatever, is mild and slower releasing. So that's not going to give them the shock of getting too much too fast, right?
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure. Nancy.
Hi, could you talk about soil testing and temperature?
Sure. So soil testing isn't something I do much of because having done it for many years, I realized like we have the soil we have. And for the most part, the Great Northwest is pretty similar in that, like, especially if you're on Bainbridge, for instance, you know that almost all our soil is acidic. You either have blue clay underneath it or sandy deposits that are iron rusty, kind of reddish sandy, but they're both pretty acidic. So rather than worry about that too much, just remember that compost is a great buffer. It's a neutralizer because it's pH neutral. And by using it several times a year, you will have essentially buffer your soil enough to get it to where most plants will be pretty happy about it. The other thing, for some things like potatoes that tend to get a lot of skin blemishes and stuff in acidic soil, you can think about growing them in like a trough, a big watering trough, for instance. Or some people like to grow them in those tall barrels with holes drilled into the side so that the leaves could come out and shoot that way, and you fill it up as the stems progress, you keep adding more soil. So eventually you have most of the plant is underground, but when you dump it out at the end of the season, all those potatoes are clean because they haven't been exposed to the acidic native soil. They've been grown in potting soil. But I will say that some potting soils are not that nutritive. So there are blends, and E.B. Stone makes one, and I think again ACE has a couple of different kinds that are called planting compost. That's more like a combination of topsoil and compost. That's a good mix for a neutral loving crop.
And also, is it too early to plant peas and spinach right now?
No, and that's a great question. So the temperature thing is really good because what you'll see if you've grown like sweet peas in the past and you let some of them just drop their peas, their pods around, they'll start sprouting often at this time of year. Everybody got kind of stuck when it froze so hard. So anything that was starting to grow kind of backed it off and stopped active growth. But I'm seeing pea shoots coming up all over the place for my sweet peas. And if sweet peas can do it, then so can edible peas. And St. Patrick's Day has been a typical time to grow peas, to start peas. So yeah, you're well within the range. And the worst that can happen, just sow a little row. If they don't do much, you can sow another one in a week and another one in a week. And then sooner or later, you'll hit the magic time and they'll come up fine. They're not expensive really. But for the most part, the peas especially are a good, easy crop. And, Anita was talking about planting garlic earlier. A lot of old time growers plant the garlic around the winter solstice. But if you plant a crop now, it will be a midsummer crop instead of an early summer crop. So that's another one you can put in again. And then what was the other thing you asked? I'm sorry.
I think, temperature, soil temperature.
Yeah.
Is that something to worry about?
Well, it's nothing to worry about, but it's something to be aware of. So yeah, if you, there are soil thermometers and there's also those relatively inexpensive food thermometers and they'll do the same thing. But you want to watch, really, rather than worry about the soil temperature, look at night temperatures. If you have a phone that tracks high, low temperatures for the day, which many of us do, or even a thermometer that records those things, like I used to have one, you watch for night temperatures being up into the mid 40s, because that means right now the night temperatures can still be down at 30, 32. There's been ice a couple times in the puddles in this last week. So there's going to be crops that are not too happy about that. Now, one group of plants that you could easily get started now would be kale and a lot of the leafy greens. And even you can still do winter lettuces, like the Four Seasons types lettuce. A lot of the Bib types or red romaines are really pretty frost hardy, and they don't mind the cool soil because they're a cool season crop and they might be a little delayed. But one thing I like to do with them too is I start them indoors and I save these. This one's been through a few cycles, so it's not pristine, but the lettuce boxes that have this cover that flips up, so you can plant in a few inches of compost, and then I poke holes in the side, if you can see them, and then so that it can breathe, and you can put the top down and let it be like a little mini greenhouse. And when things start to germinate, I prop it open to get better air circulation so they don't get mold or anything. But as they grow up, you can do a couple things. You can just snip some of them throw them in your salad, but you can plant them out too as little starts. And to me, that's a kind of triple win, right? Because especially if you have packets of seed that have aged out a little bit, I have some somewhere I don't know where I put it. But if, it will usually say packed for the season of, and maybe it says 2023 or 2024, or maybe it says 2000, or maybe it says who knows what. So it's always worth a try. And some of that older seed, it won't germinate as well, but it might still well germinate. So I will grow on a batch like that, mini, like microgreens, right? Which you could pay a fortune for. You can use all your old seed packets and give it a shot. And whatever comes up, again, use nail scissors and you can snip them so you're not disturbing everybody else's roots, and put them in your salads, use them as garnish, and plant out anybody that looks like they're going to make it.
Great idea. Thank you.
Yeah.
Robin, did you have a comment?
Excuse me. Yes, I have a question. I couldn't find the little hand raised or whatever to signal I had a question. Sorry, I didn't get in time, but back to wood chips. I've always tried to figure out which wood chips are safe for dogs to walk on and then lick their paws. I've read that cedar is bad, and some of the dyed chips. Any ideas about that?
Yeah, so the ones that are really dangerous are the dyed ones. And you're right, like beauty bark has been dyed. Any chips that come in and they're really black or very uniform brown, they're dyed. And you'll notice if you handle them that your gloves will turn brown. And those are dyed for uniformity of appearance, but they're not
Okay.
really dyed with food safe. And nobody's thinking about that. You know, they're made to be put around those sheared blobs in somebody's dead garden where everything is this, okay, I'll
They're
shut
made
up.
to be put around things like themselves.
Yeah. But it's not wholesome or healthy at all, but natural wood chips. And so one of the things is like bark chips on the whole are just bark and they don't provide a ton of nutrition. Wood chips, on the other hand, the arborist chips particularly, are the whole tree. And so they contain a lot of times foliage, lichens, all kinds of stuff. And as they break down, they're a lot more complex. And you can get different grades of them. Like a lot of the delivery places have, coarse or fine. The coarsest of all is sold as hog fuel, and that stuff is what they use on roadside, when they're doing huge projects and then they cover the whole thing, big,
Right.
coarse, heavy. That's really good stuff for like a degraded forest where you're trying to create beds and stuff. That's perfect because they'll break down slowly. They have everything that the soil is going to need. In the garden, we usually go with a medium or even a more of a fine. At the senior center, we've used mostly medium, which seems to include a lot of interesting objects sometimes. Like, I think they run everything through these tub grinders and whatever comes through. But sometimes there's stuff that isn't really what you want. So you have to kind of pay attention. But if that finer grade is really quite fine, and you definitely want to wear gloves or you get a lot of splinters out of that. And I would mix that with the compost because it's almost too fine to really be an effective heavy mulch all by itself. But for animals, and that would be the very fine would be the kind they would get stuck in their pads probably. But yeah, as far as cedar bark is actually has chemicals, natural chemicals in it that are suppress growth in a lot of plants, including a lot of weeds, which is fine, but also a lot of garden plants. So it's not one to put on your beds and borders, but it's a great one for the path, like the pathway where you don't actually want anybody to grow up in, right?
Right. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. I think I just started to talk a little about feeding bulbs, didn't I? Because I had meant to bring in maybe I did, it is still in the sink. When you when you keep bulbs over for a couple of years, and I often have pots, those pots that you can buy at the grocery store, and they've got beautiful tulips, and you bring them for the next year, and they're not quite so beautiful. Remember to feed them and feed them like a compost mix, but also you can feed them because they're in a pot in a container and not in the soil. You can use a commercial fertilizer like you wouldn't use in the real garden, and give them a bit of a boost when they're in the green, which means their leaves are showing before, during, and after the time that they are blooming. If you want to put them in the garden, the time to do it is after they've flowered. And then when the flower stems start to soften, you can just trim those off, but leave all the leaves and put them into the garden and let them go dormant naturally. And put them somewhere where they won't get summer water. They won't get irrigated in the summertime. It's partly why I keep mine in pots and just put them under a bench or tuck them in somewhere where they won't be seen so they can go all the way dormant. But making sure that as they start to wake up, you give them another feed. And when they're starting to fade, all through their growth stage, I keep feeding them every couple of weeks. But as they start to really fade and the leaves get softer and softer, you can stop feeding them and let them just dry off and go dry, just like you would with onions that are ripening. Let them dry off completely. So the bulb has a chance to really ripen and go dormant the way it should.
So do you ever separate those bulbs that are in pots? Does that help
Sure.
them?
If they come back strong as ever and are blooming perfectly happily, I think that you don't need to. But when they start to dwindle, you'll find that the smaller bulbs, like the little daffodils, the little tete-a-tete daffodils, they'll go on for quite a few years because they're relatively small compared to the size of the pot. So there's still quite a bit of nutritive material for them to feed on for 2 or 3 years. Whereas the big tulips are like border beauties. They need a lot more, and they tend to dwindle a lot faster in captivity like that because they don't have anything to draw on. Does that make sense? But if you want to divide them, yeah, you wait till they finish blooming and then knock them out of their pot, shake them out. And you'll find a lot of times that the bulbs will have little offsets. They're called pups or bulblets, right? And some of them are very rapid spreaders, like the blue grape hyacinths, right? They will spread like crazy. At the library, if you look, you'll see purple crocus coming up all over the place now. And about 25 years ago, I planted 100 snow crocus, a lot of the Thomasinianus and the early crocus. We have thousands of them now because they seeded around and their pups got in the compost. And every time we put the compost somewhere else, we get these volunteer. It's really pretty fun. I love that, right? But there are places where I've seen sheets and sheets of snowdrops too, where in older gardens that haven't been disturbed in a long time. So yeah, you don't even have to divide them if you have a place like that where you could let them propagate themselves. But if you want to, yeah, that's a great way to do it. And if you want them in a lawn or putting them in a meadow, you can actually cut a flap, a 3-sided flap in the turf, lift it back and pop some bulbs in it and just drop the top. You don't take it off, you just like hinge it, right? Flop it back down when the bulbs are going dormant, and they'll just come up next spring right through the grass and be happy to see themselves around, as long as it's not really thick, dense turf. But on Bainbridge, it's very
It's not
unlikely.
going to happen, no. So that kind of fits into a question that Julie just posted about grassy spaces. She says, I'm looking at lots of grass for many years on the family homestead. What could I do at this time to get ready for microclover or other seeds? One big area is over a drain field and it's very sandy, which is probably not very strong grass. It's not been fertilized or watered, but it keeps going anyway. I did a no-mow May last year. Could that go on longer?
Yeah. So that's a lot of questions, actually. So let's look at kind of one by one. That um, a lot of grass, the way to start, if you have a big grassy spread, as a lot of the older houses on the island do, we've talked in the past a lot about creating some strips along the edges that would be bed and breakfast for birds, bees, and butterfly habitat strips, right? And I recommend that they be maybe 3 to 4 feet wide at the most, and as long as you want to make them, so that you can bend over easily and get in there, and just turn the sod over, cut it up, turn it over, and let it rot. You can put some topsoil on top of that and plant right into it, and start putting in things like native plants that the critters really love. But if you want it to be more ornamental, you can use a mix of native annuals and perennials. And also things like all the hardy herbs. Oregano is a great one because it's a thug in a lot of ways, but bulbs go right through it and they have no problem. And every pollinator I've ever seen just magnet gloms onto the oreganos. They love that. And things like rosemary and sage and lavender and thyme, all those are really good insect friendly plants that you could start growing on the edges of your property. And as things go on and you start to pull that edge further out, then you can start dropping in the native shrubs, things like, Indian plum, which is blooming, just starting to bloom right now with their wonderful dangling creamy ivory flowers and those funny leaves that if you taste them, they taste exactly like watermelon rind. It's really odd. And they smell like that too. But you can start dropping in huckleberries and, all the various serviceberry, anything like that, that would be wonderful habitat for somebody. And reducing the lawn by increasing the amount of native plants you put in does a couple things. Of course, it invites a lot of life into your garden. And as you go on in years 3, 4, 5, 6, and so forth, it's less and less needy because the natives are much better adapted to all the vagaries of our climate. And so unlike some of our beautiful border beauties, they don't sulk and tend to die off. They tend to just take their time, get their toes in, and then just grow happily. So planting in native shrubs, native roses, native berries will be a wonderful boon for all kinds of creatures, from birds, like I said, birds, bees, and butterflies, but a lot of the different pollinators that aren't just bees, right, will also be happy there. So taking it incrementally and shrinking the lawn is a better way to go than trying to do a big meadow all at once, because it's pretty disheartening. It's pretty hard to manage. So unless you want to hire a crew, but even then, a lot of times the crew doesn't really know what to do that. So it's much better to take it step by step and go a little bit slow that way. When you,
About no mow
yeah,
and letting it go.
no mow. Well, here's the thing. If you really no mow for a long time, what you get is a small forest because we have the pioneer trees around here are alders and sometimes serviceberries. And sometimes you'll start seeing, well, very quickly, you'll start seeing firs, Doug firs, hemlocks, cedars. And within a few years, they're, knee high and then they're waist high and then they're over your head. So if that's what you want, that's great. But you're also going to see Scotch broom and you're also going to see holly and ivy. And you're also going to see a bunch of other stuff like tansy, ragwort that you don't really want. So again, when you start doing no mow, it's probably the best plan to think about mowing 2 or 3 times a year to keep the plants that you don't really want. And among those prime are probably blackberries because the non-native blackberries, European cutleaf and the so-called Himalayan blackberries are pretty implacable once they get going. And granted, they're good habitat and a lot of birds will love them and a lot of insects really like those flowers, but they are takeovers and they actually put out chemicals from their roots that impede other plants, including our natives. Alders seem to be pretty impervious, but a lot of other native plants get killed by the blackberries as they spread. So to stop that, you want to mow 3 to 4 times a year. And when the blackberry plants are growing up and their leaves are all pointed upward and they're very soft looking and pale, they're still feeding off the mother root. And then they open up and go flat and they turn matte and dark and they look quite different. Then they're productive. That's when they go into their photosynthetic stage. And then they're pulling in nutrients and paying back the mom. Well, that's when you want to cut them. So I usually cut in May and then like September if it's twice, but usually you might get another, like you might do May, August, October as a good 3-season run for blackberries. And that's also on your drain field, like you don't want them on your drain field. I did want to talk a little about the drain field question because often they are really sandy and sometimes people have those sand mounds, those Glendon mounds. They're pretty hard to grow stuff on. There's a couple things that will grow really well that are not invasive and not going to take over your garden. And one is epimedium. And there are many forms of epimedium and they're really quite lovely. They're evergreen epimediums. The common name I think is bishop's hat, but epimedium is just like EPI medium, right? And they have really pretty flowers, so you can mow them once a year or not at all. But if you want to see the flowers, you cut them all back in January or February. You get these beautiful plumes of little arching stems with tiny birds like orchids all over. I mean, tiny flowers like birds or orchids. They're really pretty, but they're tough. They don't need water. They don't need anything. They can take sun. They can take shade. They're really good choice for the shady. A lot of times the Glendon mounds and some of those sandy are in the shade. Yeah, there's a pink one. A lot of them are yellow. They're really pretty and very dainty. But that's one of the plants I really use a lot in difficult sites because it's really tough. The other one is one I've mentioned before, like if there's more sun, try a different oreganos. And you could even grow a Mediterranean herb garden on your sandy loam mound because a lot of those Mediterranean herbs do well that way, like lavender and rosemary. And again, they're great pollinator pals. As far as native plants, it's a little harder because there are not a whole lot of, I mean, there are some sand lilies and things like that, but it's harder to manage a Northwest native because there's not a lot of habitat like that. But those are good choices for those mounds. One thing about the no mow May too is like if if you have a lot of bulbs growing up in your grass, like I love that look, and you can do little daffodils and tulips and snowdrops and all that stuff. The way to perpetuate them and make them last is to do the no mow March, no mow, April, no mow, May, and wait until their foliage has completely dried up before you mow. So you don't really start mowing until June or mid-June. If it's really long and lanky, you might want to weed whack first and then do a mow, but also set your mower a lot higher and leave everything. So as you're doing that like mulching mowing, and that'll also help nutrients getting back to the soil and getting back to those bulbs. Oh, and Nancy Taylor says, I use organic soil compost and fertilizer, but I'm wondering how important it is to organic seeds. Oh, She said one year she found the dollar store seeds grow very well. Yeah, you know, there has been research about it, but not a ton. The reason some of the organic seeds are particularly valuable is in some strains of vegetables that have viruses associated with them. Spinach is a huge one. And the organic crops are specifically grown to be able to thrive without pesticides, so they do not have those virus strains in the seed. That makes sense. So, I think it's important to use organic seeds when you want to support organic growers more than anything else. But yeah, it's true. A lot of seeds will grow perfectly well, but they not all of them will. One of the things I learned when I worked for a nursery and went to a lot of conferences was that the seed industry on the whole thinks that the gardener is an unquestioning market that will always blame themselves if something goes wrong. So if there's poor germination or low germination, they'll say, oh, I must have done something wrong, not, wow, this must be old seed, or these guys are passing off junk on me. And I will say, when you find, like, I love Ed Hume seeds, and they're not all organic, but they're all small growers. And he's done a really nice job with that. And I love to use those seeds because they're kind of local, and a lot of them are organic too. Okay, Anne says,
Another one from, but I have a large septic leach field
yeah,
with grass over it. Could clover be added to the
sure.
grass?
Yeah. And so, yeah, a leach field, definitely you can do the low mow. I wouldn't do the no mow again because you're going to get trees and stuff, and you don't want trees in your leach field. But clovers, sure. One thing you want to think about is, like, there's a lot of different clovers out there. Some of the red clovers are really good pollinator plants, and they're really quite beautiful. Some of them are super aggressive, and some are not. So I would tend to use more of the annual clovers at first, so that you're not bringing in, because I mean, if you've had clover in your garden, you know how hard it is to get it out. And clovers really like poor soils. They're nitrogen producers and nitrogen storers. So when you dig up those clovers, you can see little nodules, pink or white kind of bumps, like little pop beads hanging off their roots. That's nitrogen they've pulled out of the air and they're storing it. So I don't pull them up anymore. I cut them off at the root, or put the roots back down on top of the soil and let that nitrogen get put back in. But the annual clovers are not going to run all over the place and take over your yard. If you have a big area like that where you don't mind that it's going to be all clover, that's great. One thing to be aware of is if you have kids around, grandkids running around barefoot or whatever, when you have clover fields, you have a lot of blossom and you have a lot of bees and other pollinators, and that means stung feet. So it's just something to be aware of if you're going to go globally with clover, right?
Okay, and Nancy is back with a question about growing potatoes, right?
Yep. And so here's the thing about potatoes. If you get a lot of potatoes that are not organic have been treated to not sprout. And by the time they do, they're not sprouting very strongly because they're kind of bursting through the chemical treatments. If you get organic potatoes, it's cheaper if you buy one organic potato at whatever price it is, and it has 6 or 7 or 8 eyes, you're way ahead, because you just cut those up, I put them on a cookie sheet. I mean, a cookie cooling rack. I have a little grid one, and you can cut the cubes with the eye, let them air dry for a day or two so that so you're not putting raw flesh into the soil. Does that make sense? You let it cure a little bit and get a bit of a skin develops over the cut. And when they turn into little fat cubes with an eye and a sprout, then you can plant each of those. And because they're organic, they're going to be free of virus. They won't have scab. They won't have a whole lot of other issues that you could get from the commercial. Potatoes are actually a very highly, let's see, they use a lot of fertilizer and they use a lot of pesticides on potatoes. So that's why the organic ones, that's what I would grow personally. And again, you buy one blue one and one yellow one and one white one, and you'll have so many plants you won't know what to do with them all. And you're out $5, right?
Other thing that you had talked about, I think, a little bit was the idea of other things that you might be planting in seeds about now.
Yeah. And again, all the greens I would start. But also, if you're planning to grow tomatoes, this is a good time to start the tomato plants indoors. And it only is a good place if you have a really sunny windowsill or a little greenhouse or even a sun porch or something like that. Again, the night temperatures are running pretty low, so you have to have kind of a sheltered spot indoors. But this is a good time to get them started because you're not going to be able to put them out for a few months at least, right? Usually, it depends. They're talking, NOAA is saying that they think that the El Nino is breaking up and La Nina is kicking in, which might mean that we get a warmer, drier summer, but it might mean that we don't. And so we don't really know. But if we do get a warmer, drier summer, then you could start putting tomatoes out in May or June, late May, early June, which means growing them on in your house for a while, right? Because if you start them the end of February, you've got March, April, May. And that's about what it takes to get a good sized plant. Because you start them, I would start them in one of my little lettuce boxes and then plant them out into 4-inch pots. And as they fill that up, I put them into a quart or a gallon. And it takes a while to kind of, because rather than putting a little teeny plant into a too large pot, you want to just pot them up each time to something slightly bigger because little plants in bigger pots tend to, it's funny because you could put it in the garden, but if you put it in a big pot, they often don't do so well because they're getting more water and fertilizer than they would be in the garden, and they don't handle it very well sometimes. So stepping those plants up increment by increment, it takes time and it's an effort, but that's something you could think about doing now. Also, there's lots of hardy annuals to start right now. Calendulas are one of my favorites. I talk about them all the time. But those are, they bloom almost every month of the year. And they're just such wonderful, starry, happy, sunny, cheerful little flowers. I just love them. And putting those out early means they'll be blooming early, and then they're great pollinator plants. And if you have a big vegetable patch or even fruit trees and crops of things like berries, you might want to plant calendulas and sweet William all around the base because they will pull the pollinators in for you and make sure that even in a year when we're not getting a great pollinator year, or when the fruit crops are blooming late or scantily, like we don't know what's going to happen if they all start blooming and you get that cold wind and the really hard sleet or something, we can lose a lot of blossom and not get much crop. So having a lot of pollinator attractors around is just a really good strategy for making sure you get the best fruit set you can.
Did you want to get in here?
Oh, yeah, I wanted to say that, I used to pot my little tomato seeds in little pots and then I'd put them in bigger pots and then a great big pot, if I had a summer that was wet and cool. And then so a year or so ago, I decided, well, I'm going to start them in big pots, so I can save all that time and effort. And they didn't do as well. And I was like, why is this? They're better, like you were just saying, start them out little and do all the extra work.
It's true because they kind of drown. It's like putting a child in a king size California king bed or something. They get lost in there. They need to be snugger than that when they're growing up.
So
But
you
yeah.
need to think about where you're going to put them in your house and environs.
And what you're going to put them on, because as they get bigger and bigger, you need better saucers and things like that. I've picked up those rimmed baking sheets at Rotary in different places for not much because they're not leaking. You can put a lot of stuff in there and over water or have it splash around or whatever, and they don't wreck your bookshelf or windowsill or whatever it is. I did want to talk a little about taking cuttings, that this is a good time to take cuttings of certain things. I have in my neighborhood, we have a kind of a hedge of sweet box, Circa Coca, which has this incredible perfume all through the winter. And they're teeny white flowers. I don't know if you'll be able to even see them. They're so little, but this is what they look. This is what it looks like. It's a nice evergreen with good foliage. And a neighbor was interested in plants. So I just stuck a bunch of them in this water and they're starting to just begin to put roots out already. They usually take about a month and they'll put out nice strong roots. And it's a whole lot easier than trying to dig out this matted root system and then pull this mangled thing up and try to get it happy. So that's a great way to go. And I was also at the library taking care of some of the Russian sage, which is that tall, silver stemmed plant with the beautiful blue flowers that last almost all summer in big, sort of wonderful lances. And I'm taking the stems that have nice looking buds on them and taking about 6-7 inches worth of it that's gonna, and then jamming them into this pot with very firm potting soil mixed with a little sand. So it's good drainage, but it's good nutrition, and keeping them outside. And this, from now through about the middle to the end of March, depending on the year, is a really good time to get cuttings going, because the cool weather really promotes root growth, and they haven't really started, and I cut the tops off so that there's no blooming tips involved, because you don't want them getting confused and working on flowers. I'm like, no, you think about roots right now. So you want them focused that way, so that that's what, they're going to put their energy into. But hydrangeas, if you are taking the tops off your hydrangeas and there's one that you just love, take a few more inches of it and stick them, um, so that at least 2 or 3 inches is under the soil, and take the sprouts off that part, and then have a good 3 to 4 inches sticking above. And a lot of times you'll get 60–80% of them will strike, which is pretty cool. It's a nice way to share plants or swap plants. I also just like to bring stuff in because it looks good and smells good. Like Daphne odora is one of my favorites, and it's one that blooms no matter what the temperature's doing. It's a good winter bloomer, and it's a wonderful smell. They don't always, yeah, this one just dropped a leaf. They don't always appreciate the frost, and they'll get that black stuff on them, but they'll grow through that. And so I cut I cut the flowers off some of the most damaged stems, because they're going to be not doing well anyway. And then I can enjoy the flowers and not worry too much about. But I didn't do it earlier because you never know when another frost is going to happen. And like I said, it was 30 degrees last week. That's frost. So if you take all the winter kill off the first time and you notice it, then the next time that frosts, you lose a little more. Whereas if you leave it on, take your glasses off so it doesn't bug you. Just like, don't look at it, but wait until things calm down. And hardy fuchsias, this is the second or third year in a row that some of the hardy fuchsias got really hammered. And a lot of people are saying, oh, I cut it back. And it's like, don't do that. Just wait and wait and wait. And worst case, it'll probably shoot from the base. But best case, if you don't take a lot of the top off, you'll start to see it at least halfway up. And then you can cut back to that like in the end of March. And then the plants will do great. But hardy fuchsias are one that, first of all, it's like growing your own bird food, right? Because hummingbirds love hardy fuchsias and they bloom so long. But also, if you plant them deeper than you would ordinarily, like you plant them like a tomato, so right, not just here, but you plant them deep, they will be much more frost hardy, and they'll come back slower, but they'll come back stronger. I also cut some forsythia, or properly forsythia, because it was for Mr. Forsyth. But I love these. And these are also going to sprout roots, even though they're blooming. Forsythia is one of those super forgiving plants that will sprout at the drop of a hat. And there's some really fun forms of it. Like there's, at Waypoint, I put in these creeping ones called Gold Rush that are only like 2 feet tall, but they get like 6 or 8 feet wide, and they turn into sheets of gold in the spring. So that's kind of fun. I love that. And there's suspensa, an old fashioned type that will get dangling. Like I put them on walls sometimes that are high walls. It'll dangle 10–15 feet and make sheets of gold too. And that's pretty fun. Good. You have to figure out the right place for it though, because next to the door, probably not the right place. Things that are going to get really big, give them all the room they want. Don't try to keep them where they have to be whacked all the time to keep them in line, because that just isn't, that's a losing battle. Nobody wins, right? Oh, Nancy said, what's a good fertilizer for veggies, liquid or powder? So I like to use Dr. Earth. There's a whole line of them. They have both liquids and not powder so much, but like, it looks like chicken scratch, honestly. It's it's a mixture of slow release things, and there's corn gluten in it, which corn gluten is, of course, a weed suppressant, but it's also very high in nitrogen. It's also like 911 or pretty close to the 921, I think. So corn gluten is a great fertilizer for a lot of plants that are like the vegetables, that they're going to take their time growing. One thing to think about though is, because there is corn gluten in it, you don't want to spread that fertilizer and then sow seeds right next to it, because it suppresses seed growth. Corn gluten will fertilize anything that's growing, but what happens when seeds sprout, and that's why it's used as a weed treatment, a weed preventative. when the seed starts to sprout, the corn gluten binds with it and causes the sprout to dry up. So nothing works, right? But if you spread it all over your vegetable garden thinking you're adding fertilizer and then you happily plant a row of something, it's not going to happen. So you want to put starts in, but not start seedlings in it. Does that make sense? And one of the cheapest ways to get corn gluten in bulk is as calf manna at a nursery that sells like bay hay, that sells, animal stuff too. It comes medicated or non-medicated, and I would definitely recommend you get the non-medicated because you do not want to put a bunch of antibiotics into your soil because your soil is biotic in nature and that's what you want, right? We don't want to kill off the biota, we want to promote it. So unmedicated calf manna is a whole lot cheaper to buy a 20-pound bag than it is to buy a little nice box of corn gluten as a, horticultural fertilizer.
You mentioned humic acid before. Does that fit in here?
So humic acid is not a fertilizer exactly. It's a soil amendment, and humic acid is one of the active components of compost. It helps build soil tilth and soil quality, and it helps soil hold water better while not getting soggy. It's like one of those seemingly contradictory things. But so I do use humic acid, and I scatter that a lot, especially on degraded soil, which is kind of every place on the island is degraded soil, really. It's a good way to help the soil build back its what we call its tilth, its good qualities of texture as much as anything, right? So yeah, but it's not a fertilizer. So fertilizer as such, again, Dr. Earth has liquid forms and it has these scratch in types, and you can scratch it in or put it down and put a little of that compost on top of it. And remember, when you're putting down compost around with plants that are in the ground, you don't put it around their neck. You put it around their shoulders. Like you want it to be at the drip line of where the plant's going to be when it's there. Like if there's just starting to stand up a few shoots, remember to, like, okay, in the summer, this was this big. So that's where the active feeder roots are, is out on the perimeter. Because they grow outward from the core, right? And so when we put fertilizers, now I talked earlier about doing that around lettuce and stuff, but lettuce and other annuals, veggies, when you're putting them in the ground, their root system is only not much bigger than their necks or whatever, right? So you do put it right around there because that's where at that time, that's where their growing roots tips are. But later on, as plants get bigger, and especially with mature plants, so for trees, you don't want to put fertilizer around their necks. You think about where's the drip line, or where would the drip line be if I hadn't cut all those branches off? Because that is where the action really is. Did that answer what you were asking, Nancy? I don't know if I.
No, that was really good. You're saying things that I'm realizing I've erred in the past. And I work so hard at veggie gardening, and I never feel like I've produced worth all of the effort. And it's frustrating.
It is frustrating, especially because it's kind of stacked against you. Because, like I said, we don't have good soil, and
Right.
vegetables are, very short-lived. Most of them are annuals, and they have one chance of making it. And if they get checked because we had a dry spell and you're not there, or they get soggy and soaked because it's been raining and raining and raining and it's really cold and they start to get mold and mildew, they don't come back very well. They're not very resilient. Annuals on the whole are not. So, if things aren't perfect, which they usually aren't, they don't do so well. And you try to grow tomatoes and peppers and eggplants, and you're like, what do you think, you're in Iowa? You're not. This is not that climate. But the good news is there's companies like Territorial Seed Company, which have been specifically created to find seeds, look for plants, and Loghouse Plants does this too. They look for plants that will do well in the Maritime Northwest. That's a pretty specific market. And it's not, Johnny's or some of the Renee's, those are great, but Johnny's in Vermont. Okay. So Johnny does great in Iowa, but Johnny doesn't do so well here necessarily. So I really look for like the local seed companies. That's why I like Ed Hume, because he also chooses plants that are regionally appropriate. And, I don't know if you've ever been to Puyallup, but they have.
Oh, I have. I lived in Tacoma, and I have a bone to pick with Ed Hume, so I can't buy his seeds.
Oh, no.
He used to advertise for Corey's slug bait when it was toxic, and
Well, now
I bought it thinking that, well, Ed Hume would never.
I did too. I thought it was great. When it first came out, we had no idea because iron oxide is not toxic. But what's toxic in Corey's is not the iron oxide. It's the binder that binds the bran to the iron oxide. And it was only discovered because some lab in Germany, an independent lab, did a whole analysis of it and started saying this stuff is toxic. Well, we knew it was toxic for the slugs. And the thing is, too, if you broadcast it, birds will eat it. But it turned out later that was sort of blown up that it wasn't really, it's more like, not like library paste, but it's like the toxic quantity is very, very small. And if you're using it correctly and not broadcasting it, you're not really going to be damaging. But the beauty of iron oxide is it is a naturally occurring substance. It's in water, it's in soil, it's everywhere. But when it's concentrated like that, it dries the slugs up.
Wasn't there a peanut butter? We had 2 toy dogs that went after it, and we ended up taking them to the emergency room, and their lives were saved. But it was a day. It was awful.
Oh yeah.
And I vacuumed it up. Actually, I vacuumed it up.
Oh my God. Well, we had a dog get into commercial fertilizer as well, not that one, fertilizer, and got very, very sick and got brain damage, and it was horrible. So yeah, I mean, any of these things concentrated, it's like a toddler getting under your sink and riddling around and tipping over taking a slug of the Ajax or something. But generally speaking, and so Sluggo has been reformulated also since that time, which was quite a long time ago now. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
even the Sluggo now isn't good. The maximum, the high-powered Sluggo has become toxic, right?
No, the way that you use it correctly is to put maybe a 1/4 teaspoon around each vulnerable plant at the base. Because again, that's where the slugs are coming, right?
Right.
And you're not trying to kill every slug, and they're very specific. I mean, it kills mollusks. So unless your garden is overrun by clams or oysters or something, your target is really just slugs, right? So you don't want to throw it all over the place because that is attractive to birds, which a small amount would not harm a bird. If a bird ate a whole bunch of it, like your dog scarfed up a bunch of it, it probably would. But it's basically bran and iron oxide. And now the binder is not the toxic binder, but it's this, I don't know what you'd say. Things get branded and we get it in our heads too. It's like a lot of things have been reformulated, but we have to remember to learn how to use them properly before we think that they're not working. Does that make sense?
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah,
Because
and
I
if the
spread
coffee
it
grounds-
widely. I just throw it out like bird seed.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and if the coffee grounds work, that's a better solution from the start.
Yeah,
For the slugs, it's awesome because you're feeding the plant and the soil, and you're turning the slugs into beautiful ornaments that could become cool little earrings if you just sprayed them gold.
Thank you so much.
Susan,
You're welcome.
I just want to make a little comment in terms of the vegetable garden on Bainbridge. I lived under the fir trees for 30 years, so I only could garden at other people's houses, and it's just really all location, right? Just like real estate. And then when you find the perfect soil and no wind and good sun, then there's the predators, so there's just so much involved. And I want just one plug for seeds for local area. I bought some Seattle's Best tomato seeds last summer. Oh my gosh, they were great. They were like medium sized, sweet, and just everything promised. Seattle's Best.
They're really reliable. And that's a thing, like to look at those. And again, Log House Plants sells starts of regionally appropriate tomatoes and like 50 kinds, and they will do well here, and again, territorial seed is really good that way. Like the seeds that you get from there are really specific for our region. And yeah, if it's called Seattle's Best or Oregon Sunrise, you can actually, the Oregon is a little deceptive because we used to call them the land of real summer. They do have warmer nights than we do. And it's the cool nights up here that make it harder for things like, the classic heat lovers, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, stuff like that. But, so little greenhouses are a good help, or bubble wrap in a pinch.
This has been a great hour. I'm sorry to say it's passed, but we will be getting together again on March 20th, and we can share our progress.
Yep,
Thank you,
that
Anne.
sounds great. Thanks, everybody, for showing up.